She was my neighbor, but every glance made me feel like the world had shifted. Until one evening, she stepped closer and said, "Let's stop pretending this is nothing." The first time I really noticed her, I was walking past her garden, juggling a grocery bag heavier than it should have been. She was on her porch, tending to a small cluster of potted plants, sunlight catching her hair in a way that made it glow like spun gold. I'd seen her before, of course. She was my neighbor, a presence in the background of my daily routine. But this morning, something about the quiet focus in her eyes made it impossible to look away. "Need a hand with that?" she asked, her voice warm but casual, carrying a note of amusement, as if she already knew I was clumsy. There was a softness in her tone that made my chest tighten unexpectedly. I handed her a bag, and our fingers brushed for a moment. A brief, electric contact that lingered far longer in my mind than it should have. I felt awkward, of course. 24 years old, barely out of college, and here was a woman, effortlessly poised, with a presence that felt both intimidating and intoxicating. She laughed softly when I stumbled over my words, and the sound was light, like wind chimes stirred by a gentle breeze. I noticed the small details, the way her hands moved over the plants, careful but confident. The way the corners of her lips lifted in a smile that didn't just reach her eyes but seemed to radiate warmth across the entire porch. I tried to focus on the mundane reason I was there, the groceries, the bags, the errand, but everything seemed peripheral. My mind kept returning to the subtle brush of our hands, the glimmer of sunlight on her hair, the quiet rhythm of her voice. I realized, almost with a start, that I'd been holding my breath during the entire encounter. She leaned closer to set a bag down and looked at me directly. For a second, it felt like time slowed. Her gaze was steady, curious, and yet there was a vulnerability beneath it. A softness that made her more approachable, more human, more irresistible. I wanted to say something clever, something that would leave an impression, but all I could manage was a stammered, "Thanks for helping." She smiled again, a faint tilt of her head, and for a moment, I swore she was reading my thoughts. Then, just like that, she returned to her plants, leaving me with a lingering warmth where her touch had been and a sudden awareness of how much my heart had raced in such a short span of time. That was the first spark, subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there. It wasn't a grand gesture or an over-the-top display of attraction. It was in the small moments. A shared smile, a fleeting touch, the quiet, unspoken recognition that we both felt something shifting between us. I walked home that morning with a weight in my chest, a mixture of excitement and hesitation, aware that something had begun, something that would change the rhythm of my days in ways I couldn't yet predict. And yet, I didn't dare speak about it. Not yet. Not until I could figure out what it was I was feeling, and what it was she might be feeling too. After that first encounter on her porch, I found myself noticing her everywhere. Not in an intrusive way, more like the way you notice a favorite song playing faintly in the background, and suddenly it dominates your thoughts. I'd see her watering the tiny garden she seemed to nurture as much as herself, her hands moving with care over each plant. The sunlight caught the strands of silver in her hair, and it glinted in a way that made her look timeless, like she carried a quiet wisdom the world had yet to recognize. I would walk past her street every morning, ostensibly to get some fresh air, but in truth, I found myself hoping to catch even a glimpse of her. Sometimes she'd be on her balcony, phone in hand, and our eyes would meet for the briefest instant. The corner of her lips would lift into a small, knowing smile, as if she could feel the tug between us without a word spoken. Each time, I'd feel a jolt, a sudden awareness of my own heartbeat and the heat rising to my cheeks. It wasn't just her beauty that drew me in. It was her presence, confident yet approachable, calm yet keenly aware. There was a rhythm to her movements, the gentle sway as she carried a watering can, the tilt of her head as she examined a leaf. And there was a vulnerability beneath it all, subtle, hidden in the crease of her brow or the way she lingered just a fraction longer in the sunlight, like she was absorbing life slowly, purposefully. Our fleeting interactions became a ritual of quiet observation. Sometimes I'd offer a small wave from the sidewalk, and she'd respond with a soft nod, barely noticeable, but it made my chest lift with warmth. Other times, she'd glance down from her balcony, and I'd pretend to be lost in my phone or bag, only to catch her gaze again. A magnetic pull I couldn't resist. Even the sound of her laughter floating through an open window could make the dullest day feel vivid and alive. There were moments when our proximity forced small, accidental touches. A brush of shoulders when she came out to greet a delivery, hands briefly meeting over a fallen leaf, fingers brushing as we reached for the same package. Each time, the contact lingered in my mind far longer than it did in reality. It was in those tiny sparks, those almost invisible connections, that the tension between us grew. I began noticing the subtleties of her world too, the scent of her perfume mixing with the earth and flowers in her garden, the soft hum of her voice when she spoke to a neighbor or laughed at something I couldn't hear. It made me feel like I was only seeing fragments of her life, yet each fragment pulled me closer, building a quiet obsession I couldn't name aloud. And so, day by day, I continued my walks, continued my glances, and continued my silent fascination. I didn't speak of it. Not yet. Not until I understood the gravity of my own emotions, and whether she felt even the faintest echo of the same pull. Because in these quiet observations, something had begun to bloom, delicate, patient, and charged with the unspoken promise of more. It happened on an ordinary evening, the kind of evening you don't expect to remember, yet it carved itself into my memory in vivid detail. I was returning from the grocery store, the bag swinging awkwardly in my hand, when I noticed her struggling with a stack of boxes on her porch. Without thinking, I called out, "Hey, do you need a hand?" Her head turned, and for a moment, the world felt suspended. The familiar warmth of her smile, the way her eyes softened at the edges, made my chest tighten. She nodded, stepping aside just enough for me to come closer. As I bent to pick up the lower box, our hands brushed. Not a fleeting touch this time. It lingered, just enough for a shiver to travel up my arm. I could feel the subtle warmth of her fingers, a gentle weight that made me acutely aware of the space between us. We worked side by side, stacking the boxes on the porch, our shoulders almost touching. I was conscious of every movement. The soft sway of her hair as she leaned to lift a box, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the warm evening air, the light rustle of her clothes as she adjusted her stance. Each detail grounded me in a moment I wished could last forever. At one point, she turned to hand me a box, and our eyes met in a shared pause. It was silent, but it spoke volumes. There was curiosity there, yes, but also something more. An unspoken recognition that the simple act of being near each other carried weight. A silent acknowledgement of the tension that had been building over weeks of fleeting glances and quiet observations. Then it started to rain. Light at first, then heavier, drumming on the roof above her porch. We both froze, momentarily caught off guard. Without thinking, she grabbed an umbrella, holding it in such a way that it barely covered both of us. We were forced to stand closer than we ever had before. The warmth of her presence pressed against me, the scent of rain mingling with the faint sweetness of her perfume, and I realized how acutely aware I was of her proximity. Her gaze lingered on mine longer than necessary, and I felt the electricity in that gaze, that subtle pull that made me want to step closer, to say something daring, to bridge the space that still remained. But neither of us moved. Instead, we laughed, nervous, breathless, the sound mingling with the patter of rain. Our shoulders brushed again, accidentally on purpose, a quiet acknowledgement that the unspoken was no longer entirely avoidable. By the time the rain eased, we had moved the last box inside. She looked at me, a faint blush coloring her cheeks, and whispered, "Thanks for helping." Her words were casual, but the way she said them, the softness, the slight hesitation, made my heart feel impossibly full. That night, as I walked home, I replayed every movement, every glance, every brush of fingers. For the first time, the tension wasn't just in my imagination. It was real, tangible, and I knew, even then, that something had shifted between us, irrevocably. The spark had grown into a quiet flame, and I was powerless to ignore it. The The first time we really talked, it wasn't dramatic or orchestrated. It was quiet, almost accidental, the kind of conversation that slips into your life and leaves an impression you can't shake. She had invited me in to help her move a few items from the porch inside, and we ended up sitting on her couch, each with a cup of steaming tea in our hands. There was a comfortable silence at first, the kind that feels alive rather than empty. I watched her as she spoke softly to herself while arranging a small stack of books. The light from the late afternoon sun framed her face, highlighting the gentle curve of her cheek, the subtle warmth in her eyes. I realized I was staring, not out of rudeness, but because I couldn't tear my gaze away. There was something magnetic about the way she existed in that space, effortless and human all at once. Eventually, words began to fill the silence. They started cautiously, small confessions about mundane things. Her favorite books, her memories of traveling, little regrets tucked away like fragile souvenirs. But slowly, the conversation deepened. She shared a story of a loss she'd never mentioned to anyone else, and I found myself leaning forward without thinking, letting her words settle in my chest. I offered small gestures of understanding, a nod, a soft, "I get that," and she gave me a fleeting, appreciative smile, her fingers brushing the edge of her teacup. I noticed the tiny ways she revealed herself. A sigh that escaped when she thought no one was listening, the tilt of her head when she was lost in thought, the way her fingers unconsciously traced the rim of the cup. I felt a strange combination of awe and protectiveness, a desire to be close but also to respect her space. And when our hands accidentally touched, my palm brushing against hers as we reached for the same blanket, the contact lingered longer than it had any right to, a quiet acknowledgement that neither of us could ignore the pull growing between us. We spoke about life, about fears, about moments that had shaped us. I found myself revealing thoughts I normally kept private. My insecurities, my longing for connection, my fascination with the way she carried herself through the world. And she listened, really listened, her gaze steady, soft, and warm, as if she could see every unspoken corner of my mind and still accepted me. It was in those subtle gestures, the lingering eye contact, the way she leaned just slightly closer when we laughed, the almost imperceptible brush of hands across the couch, that I realized our bond had deepened beyond simple neighborly courtesy. There was trust here, fragile yet powerful, a recognition of feelings neither of us fully admitted aloud. By the time I left, the world outside her door felt different. The quiet hum of the city, the distant chatter of neighbors, even the fading light of evening seemed charged with the weight of what had passed between us. Something had shifted. We had stepped closer emotionally, and the unspoken understanding that lingered in our glances and touches carried a promise. That whatever this was, it was beginning to grow, slowly, deliberately, and impossibly sweet. For a few days after our quiet confession, everything felt both heavier and lighter at the same time. I kept replaying our conversations, the lingering touches, the way her gaze seemed to search for me in crowded streets. But alongside that warmth was a creeping tension I hadn't anticipated. The doubt, the hesitation, the awareness that what I was feeling wasn't simple, and neither was she. Started small. A neighbor mentioned something innocuous about age differences jokingly, and yet the words stuck, echoing in my mind. I found myself imagining what people would think if they saw us too close, if they guessed at the silent energy flowing between us. The thought made me tense, made me question whether I was overstepping, whether my feelings were just infatuation or something deeper. She noticed it too. I could see it in her eyes when we passed each other in the hallway. A fleeting hesitation, the way she'd brush a strand of hair behind her ear just slightly longer than usual, a small falter in her smile. We were both aware of the tension, both cautious, both wanting to cross the invisible line that separated friendship from something more, yet both afraid of the consequences. One afternoon, I found her on the balcony, leaning on the railing and staring at the city skyline. I hesitated, unsure if I should approach, but the pull was too strong. "Hey!" I called softly. She looked at me, her eyes warm but guarded. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The space between us felt charged, as if the air itself was waiting for one of us to bridge the distance. I wanted to step closer, to reach out and take her hand, to reassure her with a simple touch that I wasn't afraid, that I wanted this, her, and whatever was happening between us. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned on the railing beside her, close enough to feel the warmth radiating off her body, yet careful to respect the fragile line of comfort we had yet to fully cross. We talked about trivial things, about the mundane rhythm of life, about the weather, anything to avoid the words we both longed to say. But even in small talk, the undercurrent of tension was undeniable. Every glance held meaning. Every accidental touch lingered. Every pause carried 1,000 unspoken words. When I finally left that evening, the unease followed me home. My chest was heavy with longing, but also with fear of misreading her signals, fear of judgment, fear that I might ruin whatever delicate connection we had nurtured. And yet, beneath the hesitation, beneath the self-doubt, there was an undeniable truth. I wanted her. Not as a fleeting attraction, not as a fantasy, but as someone whose presence had become essential to the rhythm of my days. And I knew she felt the same. The hesitation wasn't about lack of desire, it was about caution, about respect, about the awareness that what we were feeling was significant, delicate, and worth protecting. That tension, that careful balance between longing and restraint, became the heartbeat of our connection. Fragile, electrifying, and impossibly sweet. The evening air was warm, carrying the faint scent of her garden as I walked toward her door. I had no plan, no rehearsed lines, only a simple, urgent thought. I couldn't keep pretending that what we felt didn't exist. Every step felt like it carried the weight of weeks of unspoken words, stolen glances, and lingering touches. She opened the door before I could knock, standing there in a soft, casual dress, her hair slightly tousled from the breeze. There was a quiet intensity in her gaze, the kind that made my chest tighten instantly. No words passed between us at first. We simply stood there, the space between us charged with everything we had been avoiding. Then she stepped closer. Not aggressively, not demanding, but just close enough that I felt the warmth radiating from her. Our eyes locked, and for the first time, the hesitation that had shadowed us for days began to dissolve. "Let's stop pretending this is nothing," she said, her voice low, steady, and infused with courage. The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of all the moments we had stolen from each other. The silent longing, the unspoken acknowledgement that our connection was real and undeniable. I swallowed hard, feeling my heartbeat quicken, and reached out instinctively. My fingers brushed against hers, lingering in that small, electrifying contact. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let her hand rest lightly in mine, a silent invitation, a confirmation that she felt the same tension I had been holding back for so long. We moved inside, the ambient light from her living room soft and intimate, casting shadows that seemed to wrap around us. Every movement was deliberate yet natural. A hand resting briefly on the armrest near the other, a subtle lean closer on the couch, the occasional laugh that felt like it was shared between only the two of us. Our proximity was no longer accidental. It was chosen, a mutual acknowledgement of the pull that had been simmering beneath the surface. Her fingers brushed a strand of hair from my face, lingering on my cheek just long enough to send a shiver through me. I noticed the warmth in her eyes, the slight tremor in her lips, the way she drew in a soft breath when our shoulders touched. Everything was heightened, yet nothing felt forced. It was the culmination of weeks of subtle glances, fleeting touches, and quiet observations finally finding their release. And then we spoke, in whispers more than full sentences, about the tension, the longing, the mutual understanding that had been building. No confessions were rushed, no declarations shouted. It was intimate, deliberate, and profoundly real. Every pause, every glance, every brush of fingers carried meaning far beyond words. By the time the evening drew on, we were sitting closer than ever, hands intertwined, our gazes locked in a quiet promise. We had stopped pretending. The unspoken had become spoken. The hesitation had transformed into connection, and the subtle spark that had first caught me on her porch had grown into a steady, tender flame. For the first time, I felt the undeniable certainty that what we shared was real, meaningful, and worth exploring. together. The days after our confession felt lighter, yet somehow more intense. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was about presence. Simply being near her, sharing the quiet rhythms of life, felt profound. Every glance, every brush of hands, every subtle touch carried meaning, a reminder that we had crossed the threshold from unspoken tension to mutual understanding. That evening, I found myself on her porch again, the sun dipping low and casting warm amber light across the garden. She was already there, tending to her flowers, her movements slow and graceful, like she existed in perfect harmony with the world around her. When she looked up and saw me, a smile curved her lips, the same smile that had first caught my attention, but now softer, deeper, and threaded with trust. We sat together in comfortable silence, our shoulders touching lightly, fingers brushing occasionally as we reached for tea mugs or a stray leaf on the table. There was no rush, no urgency, only the quiet acknowledgement of our presence and the subtle intimacy that had been building for weeks. I noticed the way her hand rested near mine, almost hesitant, almost casual, yet impossible to ignore. The warmth of her skin, the delicate pressure of her touch, sent a quiet thrill through me. She spoke softly about her day, her voice carrying the same warmth and calm confidence that had first drawn me in. I listened, offering small responses, but mostly absorbing the comfort of her presence, the gentle rhythm of her words, the way her eyes lingered on me in a way that felt like both reassurance and invitation. Every laugh, every tilt of her head, every careful gesture seemed magnified in this shared space, an intimate choreography of connection. Eventually, we stopped talking, letting the silence speak. I reached out and took her hand fully in mine, intertwining our fingers in a deliberate, steady grip. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned slightly closer, resting her shoulder against mine. The moment was simple, almost mundane, yet it carried the weight of everything we had been through. The quiet observations, the hesitant touches, the longing that had grown in the spaces between words. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the garden lights flickered on, casting soft, golden glows across the porch. I felt a sense of completeness, a warmth that spread through my chest, grounding me in the certainty of what we shared. I realized that the hesitation, the fear, the silent tension, all of it had led to this. We had crossed the threshold from longing to connection, from uncertainty to trust. As I sat there, fingers still entwined with hers, I reflected on how extraordinary it was that someone could make ordinary moments feel so profound. The simple act of being near her, of sharing space and silence, was enough to make the world feel alive. And in that quiet, golden evening, I knew, whatever the future held, we had found something real, something tender, something worth holding on to. The last thought that lingered in my mind, as our hands rested together and the stars began to appear above, was simple. I never imagined someone could make the world feel this alive, and with her by my side, it did. If this slow-burn age-gap romance tugged at your heart, make sure to hit like and subscribe for more stories that linger in your mind long after the screen goes dark. Share your thoughts in the comments. Would you ever take a chance on a connection that defies expectations? And don't forget to hit the bell, so you never miss the next story that makes everyday moments feel unforgettable.